All right, so today we're going deep, like really deep into a question that's kind of like the bedrock of everything we think we know. It's like,
Sure.
what's the reason for reason itself?
Right.
You know, we've got this really thought-provoking piece by for Deacon Ananias
Oh, yeah.
called "The Reason for Reason" from Patristic Faith,
Mm.
and we're gonna like try to distill it down, pull out the most crucial ideas.
Absolutely. It's a dense one, for sure,
Oh yeah,
but super fascinating.
it is.
It gets to the heart
Yes.
of whether knowledge
Yeah.
isn't possible.
Oh yeah, for sure.
It lays out like two fundamental approaches
Okay.
that people have taken to try to answer this question.
Okay.
One, which the article calls theonomous epistemology,
Theonomous epistemology.
which basically says that our ability to know comes from divine revelation.
Okay.
And the other, which is autonomous epistemology, is like the attempt to figure it out just using human reason
Yeah.
without relying on God.
Right, right. So, like, can we figure out knowledge all by ourselves? Yeah.
Okay, so there's a lot to unpack here, but one of the key points I think that the article makes is that, like, even saying, knowledge exists isn't as simple as it sounds.
Yeah,
You know,
right.
It says that to really be sure about that,
Yeah.
you need like a second level of justification.
Yeah.
It's not just knowing something specific like, that's a tree.
Yeah, yeah.
That's like first order knowledge, right?
Yeah.
It's about knowing that we can know things at all.
Mm.
And that's the second order level. And that's where the real head scratcher is, according to this article.
Yeah, and that's something I think, like, we normally just take for granted.
Oh, we do.
We assume that we have brains and we can use our brains to figure things out.
Totally.
But what this deep dive does is it asks us to take a step back and
Yeah.
say, hold on a second, is that assumption actually valid?
Right.
It's not asking you,
Yeah.
do you know what you had for breakfast?
Yeah.
It's asking you,
How can you be sure your mind is actually capable of grasping any truth about anything?
wow, that is deep.
Yeah,
That's way deeper than my breakfast.
it is.
So the core question for our listeners today is really like, how do we determine if our ability to reason, to learn things is actually valid?
Right.
Is it built on something solid?
And like you were saying, this gets into the reason for reason.
Yeah.
Like, what are we even talking about when we say reason?
Right.
And I think it's helpful here to clarify because, like, through the history of philosophy, there's been this debate about,
Oh, yeah.
is reason, this purely intellectual faculty,
Right.
is it something that's like, divorced from experience?
Divorced from the senses.
Like, that's how the empiricists see it, but
Yeah.
but that's not actually what the article's getting at.
All right.
Instead, it's looking at reason as, like, the cognitive processes we use
Uh-huh.
for logical inferences,
Mm.
for acquiring knowledge
Yeah.
about the world around us.
Yeah. Right. So it's really about like how our minds are working,
Okay.
not some like abstract philosophical idea of reason.
Yeah.
So then this reason for reason question, it's asking, are those processes actually reliable? Are they epistemically legitimate? Can they actually get us to truth?
Exactly. Are they justified?
Right.
And this whole discussion, I mean, this takes us into, like, the field of what's called meta-epistemology,
And meta-epistemology.
which is kind of like you're
Yeah.
taking a step back from epistemology,
Ontology.
which is about knowledge.
Yeah.
And you're asking, like, what are the ultimate epistemic principles
Yeah.
that are, like, justifying all of the other things that we claim to know?
So it's like the epistemology of epistemology.
Right.
It's a meta level,
Exactly.
Okay.
So it's really searching for, like, what the article calls an epistemic first principle,
An epistemic first principle.
which would be, like, a foundational belief about knowledge that doesn't rely on other epistemic principles for its justification.
So it's like the OG, the original gangster of knowledge.
Right.
The one that's just true in itself.
Yeah, it's the starting point.
And everything else is built on it.
Right.
Okay. So to even dig deeper into this, like, what's our working definition of justification here?
Right,
Like,
yeah.
what are we talking about?
So the article gives a pretty, I'd say, broad definition
Okay.
of justification.
Okay.
It's essentially a reason
A reason.
or a correct reason
Okay.
for holding a belief or making an inference.
Okay.
It's like what makes a belief actually count as knowledge
Right. Right.
rather than just some random guess.
Okay. So, like, I believe that the stove is hot because I touched it and it burned me.
Right.
The justification for that belief is my sensory experience of the burn.
Right.
But we're going like one level deeper here. We're
Yeah.
not asking what justifies that belief.
Right.
It's like what justifies my trust in my senses in the first place.
Right. And,
Well,
and the connection between,
yeah.
the sensation of heat and the idea of the stove being hot.
Yeah, right.
That's where we're
Yeah.
getting into these, like,
It's getting meta.
it's metalogical,
Fucking meta.
meta-epistemological.
Well, we're going meta.
We're questioning,
Oh,
like, the very basis of logic and reason.
wow. Okay. So some big questions here.
Yeah.
Like, what makes logic inherently true?
Yeah.
And why should we even follow it? You know?
Right. Is it even binding on us?
Yeah. And how can we be sure that our minds can even, like, grasp reality?
Yeah.
What are the absolute, like, most fundamental things we need for knowledge? And then how do we even get access to those things?
Right. Like,
A lot.
how do we know those things?
Yeah.
Or how do we know that we know those things?
Right. We're getting real meta.
Right. Yeah.
So this is where I think things get really, really interesting.
Okay.
So the article looks at one way people have tried to answer these questions,
Right.
and it calls it autonomous epistemology.
Autonomous epistemology.
So what exactly are we talking about here?
So autonomous epistemology, as the article explains it,
Yeah.
is any attempt to understand the world
Okay.
and how we know it
Okay.
without starting with the assumption that God exists
Okay.
or that there has been any kind of divine revelation.
Got it. Okay.
So it's like the idea that human reason, all on its own,
Yeah.
should be capable of discovering truth.
Truth and knowledge.
And knowledge. Right.
Okay. And I think the article seems to have some pretty strong opinions about this approach, right?
Yeah, there are some major problems.
Like, what are the main issues that it brings up?
So I think one of the central arguments the article makes is that nobody
Yeah.
comes to the table completely neutral.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Everybody has these pre-existing beliefs
Right.
or presuppositions, as
Yeah.
the article calls them.
Okay, presuppositions.
When they're using logic,
Mm-hmm.
looking at evidence,
Yeah.
making arguments,
Yeah.
you're not just this, like,
Right.
blank slate that's
Ah.
just like,
You can't just, like, step outside of everything you think and believe, right?
Oh,
It's
yeah.
impossible.
like think in a vacuum.
Right.
Yeah.
So if everyone has these underlying assumptions,
Mhm.
how does that cause a problem for, trying to reason on our own?
So the article argues that if you try to use reason and logic
Okay.
to prove that reason and logic are valid,
Okay. Yeah.
you'll inevitably end up begging the question.
Oh, okay.
It's circular reasoning.
Okay.
So it's like saying, reason is reliable
Yeah.
because my reasoning shows that it's
Yeah.
reliable.
Right. Right.
You're already assuming
Right.
the very thing.
Right. So you're using the thing you're trying to validate it.
Right.
You're stuck in a loop.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so you're not actually proving anything. You're
Yeah.
just kind of like,
It's like a tautology.
yeah,
It's like saying,
it's true because it's
true A equals A, yeah.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
what fundamental questions does this raise for us when we're trying to understand knowledge on our own?
So the article highlights two really crucial ones.
Okay.
First, it asks, what are the necessary preconditions?
Okay.
What are the things that absolutely must be in place
Okay.
for the world to even make sense?
So like for intelligibility?
For what we call, intelligibility.
Okay.
What makes science possible,
Yeah.
logic, our experience,
Morality even, right?
even virality.
Yeah.
Like, what are the things that must be true
Yeah.
for these things to even be possible?
Right.
And then the second question that highlights is, can human reason,
Okay.
operating completely independently,
Yeah.
ever truly determine if its own processes are legitimate without falling into this kind of circularity that we've been talking about?
Okay.
Yeah.
So big questions.
Yeah.
And the article's answer seems to be a pretty strong no to that second one, right?
Yeah, pretty much.
Which leads to this whole idea of the vicious circle of second-order justification.
Oh, yeah. That's a mouthful.
Okay, let's unpack that a little bit.
Okay.
So remember we talked about first-order knowledge,
Right.
which is just like knowing something. Like, that's a cat.
That's a cat
And then second-order knowledge, which
Yeah.
is knowing that you know.
that I know.
So
Right.
the article is saying when we ask
Yeah.
if knowledge exists
Mhm.
at all,
Yeah.
that's a second-order question.
That's the meta question.
Right, yeah,
Okay.
because we're not asking about a specific fact.
Right.
We're asking about, like, the nature of knowledge itself.
Right, the very nature of knowledge.
Okay. So here's where I think the article's like core argument against, figuring out knowledge on our own really comes in, right?
Right.
It lays out this logical sequence. It says, if knowledge exists,
Okay,
and that's a first order idea,
right,
then the statement knowledge exists must also be true.
right,
And that's like a second order statement about the first order idea.
right, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
But to say that second order statement is true,
Yeah,
we have to already believe
right.
that knowledge exists in the first place.
Yeah, you see the circularity.
Right.
Yeah.
And then here's, I think, the really, really crucial part,
Well.
is that any attempt to say knowledge exists is itself a second order statement about knowledge.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It's like
Yeah.
we can never get to a pure,
Right.
first order confirmation of knowledge
Well, you can't get to
if
it.
we're only using our own reasoning.
Level.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. So the article is saying, if we rely just on ourselves,
Mhm.
we can't actually prove that knowledge exists. Because
Uh-huh.
every attempt we make to do that
Yeah.
jumps up to that second level, which already assumes the thing we're trying to prove.
Right.
And it's wild. It's like, it's like trying to pick yourself up by your bootstraps.
Yeah, that's a good analogy.
Well,
It's bootstrapping.
it's bootstrapping. Yeah.
It's circular. It's like
You can't do it.
it's stuck.
You're just stuck in a loop.
Yeah.
So can you break down this epistemic bootstrapping a little more? What is...
Yeah. So I think a good way to think about it
Yeah.
is to imagine, you have a measuring tape,
Okay.
Right.
Okay, yeah.
and you're trying to verify the accuracy of the measuring tape,
Right.
but you're using the measuring tape itself to check its reliability.
Right.
You need to already assume that the measuring tape is reliable
Right.
in order to use it
Right. Yeah.
to check its own reliability.
Oh, that's a great analogy.
Yeah. And so it's like to say, knowledge exists. To
Yeah.
prove knowledge exists, you're having to use the idea of knowledge exists
Yeah.
in the process of trying to prove it.
Right. You're stuck.
You're always stuck with that.
You're always stuck with it.
Circular dependency,
Yeah. Okay.
as the article puts it, you need statement 2, knowledge exists,
Yeah.
to prove statement 1, knowledge exists,
Mm.
but 2 itself depends on 1 being true.
Right.
You never reach a truly independent starting point.
Yeah. Okay. That's great.
Yeah.
And, the article even brings up a counter argument here.
Right.
Right. What about this idea that maybe we don't even need to justify these second order beliefs about knowledge?
Right. We could just take it as a given.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah. But the article's response to that is it's not about
Yeah.
specific models of justification.
Okay.
It's about the fact that it's just impossible
Okay.
to provide any non-circular justification.
Yeah.
For those basic first-order knowledge claims,
Right.
if you're starting from a purely human perspective,
Right.
you can't just
Yeah.
make up a story about how knowledge works
right.
and then say, well, see, my story proves knowledge is real.
Right.
Because you have no independent reason to believe
Right.
that your story's true.
Right. You're just making up a story
Yeah.
and assuming it's true.
Right.
Okay, so we're building our house on sand and it's going to fall apart.
Yeah.
And it even quotes Mannion here, right?
Yeah.
Who says, the history of philosophy shows that
Right.
humanity on its own hasn't been able to find this solid foundation
Mhm.
for knowledge.
Mhm.
And so any theory that's built just by humans
Mm-hmm.
is going to end up arbitrary and inconsistent.
Mm.
Pretty strong words there.
Yeah. I mean, the consequence is that
Yeah.
our beliefs kind of lack
Yeah.
a proper foundation.
Yeah.
And without that proper foundation,
Right.
we can't really say
Right.
that we have knowledge.
Okay, so we're hitting a wall here.
You're hitting a dead end
Dead end.
with
Okay.
this autonomous approach.
All right. So if trying to, understand knowledge independently runs into all these problems,
Mm-hmm.
where does the article go next?
Okay, so this is where it starts talking about meaning
Okay.
and the necessity of narrative.
So what's the connection there?
So the argument is that meaning is absolutely essential for knowledge.
Okay.
So if something is true,
Yeah.
if a belief is justified,
Mm-hmm.
if we claim to have knowledge,
Yeah.
all of that assumes
Mm-hmm.
that these things have meaning.
Okay.
You can't have truth or justification in a situation where nothing signifies anything.
Right. Yeah.
So if our words and ideas don't actually stand for anything,
Yeah.
then talking about whether they're true or valid is kind of pointless.
Right. It's just gibberish.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. And so this is where the article brings in this idea of narrative construction from Mannion.
Okay, so narrative construction, what is that?
So the article explains it as like any attempt to understand the world,
Okay.
to make sense of it,
Yeah.
involves putting together coherent sets of propositions, building a narrative,
Okay.
building a story,
Okay, so
our proposed justifications,
yeah.
and like epistemological systems
Hmm.
aren't just isolated thoughts.
Yeah.
They fit within a larger framework.
Right.
They fit within a story
Yeah.
that we're telling ourselves
Okay.
about how reality works.
So even like scientific theories,
Right.
philosophical worldviews,
Exactly.
these are all kind of like stories
Yeah.
trying to explain how things are.
They're grand narratives.
Yeah, right?
Yeah.
And the article makes the point that not all stories are equal.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
Some fit the evidence.
Some fit the evidence better. Yeah.
Better. Yeah.
Some are more coherent than others.
And what's really interesting here is that some stories, it says, are self-stultifying.
Self-stultifying.
What does that even mean?
It means that they contain propositions that actually undermine the very possibility of constructing a coherent narrative in the first place.
So the story itself is saying that stories are impossible.
Yeah, exactly.
Wow. Okay.
It's sawing off the branch.
It'd be crazy.
It's sitting on. So these kinds of stories, the article argues, are meaningless.
Right.
They can't actually help us to understand the world.
Because they contradict themselves.
Right.
Yeah.
So they're self-defeating.
Okay.
Yeah.
And this leads to what the article says is a really fundamental choice, like a fork in the road.
Right.
Theism versus accidentalism.
Okay.
So what's the big idea here?
So the article suggests that there are really only two basic stories that we can tell about the universe.
Okay.
One is that there's a God who intentionally created the world, its rules, logic, and our ability to understand those things.
Okay.
And the other story is that there is no God.
Okay.
And everything, the world, its rules, even our capacity for reason, ultimately came about by accident.
By pure chance.
By pure chance.
Okay, yeah.
And it sees these as fundamentally opposites.
Right, so one is a story of purpose, attention,
yeah.
And the other is a story of just randomness.
Randomness, right.
Yeah. And the article is definitely leaning toward the first story, right?
It is.
Why does it see that accidentalism, that second story, as a problem?
So the core argument here is that accidentalism, by its very nature as the opposite of intention, leads to what the article calls accidental knowledge. Accidental meaning, accidental laws, accidental logic. And these argues are essentially contradictions because knowledge meaning laws, logic, by their very definition, implies some kind of order, regularity. Purpose, right? Not just random chance.
Right, okay. So if everything is a cosmic accident? Then our thoughts, like, why would they match up with reality at all?
Right. Or why would logic be a dependable guide to truth if it itself is just an accident?
Okay.
Yeah.
So a worldview that's based on pure chance can't actually justify its own claims about the world.
Right.
Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. Or about knowledge, about arguments, or about logic.
Yeah.
It's all kind of arbitrary.
Right.
And I think the article suggests that. Like, even to talk about these things in a meaningful way. Someone who believes in accidentalism is implicitly relying on the idea of purpose.
Right. They're smuggling in purpose.
Yeah. They're smuggling it in.
Even though they say they don't believe in it. Okay, that's really interesting. So, like, by process of elimination almost.
Right.
The article is arriving at this theonomous epistemology, relying on, divine revelation for knowledge as, like, the only viable option. Okay, so how does this solve the problems that we had with, trying to reason on our own?
The argument is that if we ground our reason and our knowledge in God's revelation, it provides a foundation that isn't based on circular human reasoning.
Right, yeah.
So if our ability to reason and know things is ultimately a gift from a purposeful creator who designed us with that capacity and has revealed truths to us, then that gives us an external non-circular basis for trusting our cognitive abilities.
So it's not coming from us.
Right, it's coming from outside.
It's coming from outside.
Yeah.
Okay. And this leads to this idea of transcendentally deducing theism,
Yes.
which sounds pretty complex.
Yeah.
Can you kind of give a simplified version of what that means?
Okay, so think of like transcendental arguments
Okay.
as trying to find
Mm-hmm.
the necessary conditions
Okay.
that must be in place for something to be possible.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
in this case,
Yeah.
for knowledge to be possible,
For knowledge itself to be possible.
for knowledge itself
Yeah.
to be possible.
Okay.
So the article is suggesting that you can show that God is a necessary condition for knowledge
Right.
through
Right.
this kind of argument.